December 19th, 1944. The Ardennes forest was shrouded in a freezing, impenetrable fog that clung to the ground like a shroud. Outside the tiny, battered village of Noville, crews of the elite German 2nd Panzer Division were reporting a phenomenon that defied tactical logic. They were seeing ghosts. American armor was appearing out of the gray mist, delivering a lethal kinetic strike, and vanishing before the echo of the shot had even faded. A German Panther commander would spot a muzzle flash to his left, scream for his gunner to traverse, but by the time the massive turret groaned into position, the target was gone. Minutes later, that same Phantom would materialize on the right flank, fire again, and disappear once more. Panic began to bleed up the chain of command. German intelligence officers, frantically trying to interpret these chaotic reports, concluded that they had stumbled into a massive concentration of enemy armor. They informed headquarters that a full American armored division was entrenched at Noville. They were wrong. The Germans were not facing a division. They were facing a desperate, ragtag handful of specialized tank destroyers. These were 18-ton vehicles possessing armor so thin it could be pierced by a heavy machine gun, manned by crews who knew that a single hit meant incineration. But the Germans couldn't hit them. The Americans were driving the M18 Hellcat, the fastest tracked vehicle of World War II. And on that frozen, terrified morning outside Bastogne, the brutal laws of physics were proving that speed was deadlier than steel. To understand why this engagement unfolded with such lopsided violence, one must look at the fundamental philosophy of the German war machine. Germany had built the most feared terrestrial predators in history, the Tiger and the Panther. These were monsters, engineered to dominate the battlefield through superior range and impenetrable frontal armor. They were designed to stand and fight, to absorb punishment and return it with interest. But these killing machines harbored a catastrophic vulnerability, a mechanical Achilles heel the German engineers, in their obsession with heavy armor, had failed to solve. The issue was the turret traverse speed. In the German design, the rotation of the massive turret was powered by the main engine through a hydraulic system. The speed of the rotation was directly tied to the engine's RPM. In a perfect scenario, with the engine roaring at high revolutions, a Tiger I could rotate its turret 360 degrees in about 60 seconds. But tanks do not fight at high RPM. In an ambush, they sit stationary, engines idling to reduce noise and vibration. At combat idle, the hydraulic pressure dropped, and that same turret could take up to 4 excruciating minutes to complete a full rotation. If the hydraulics failed completely, a common occurrence in the freezing cold, the crew was forced to hand crank the mechanism. It required 720 frantic turns of the handwheel to rotate the gun once. The Panther was an improvement, but it was still fatally flawed. At a combat idle, traversing just 90 degrees to face a flank threat took between 15 and 20 seconds. In the high-speed chaos of modern warfare, 20 seconds is not a delay, it is a lifetime. This vulnerability was not an accident, it was a trade-off. But across the Atlantic, a different philosophy was taking shape, one that would exploit this exact weakness. In 1941, Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Davis Bruce took command of the newly formed Tank Destroyer Tactical and Firing Center. Bruce was a visionary who looked at the German blitzkrieg and saw a pattern that others missed. He analyzed every engagement where Allied tanks had gone toe-to-toe with Panzers and lost. His conclusion was radical and controversial. You cannot beat a tiger by trying to be a tiger. Bruce argued that American industry should not try to match the Germans in armor thickness. Instead, he proposed a doctrine based on the dynamics of boxing. A tank destroyer should be a puncher, not a slugger. It shouldn't take a hit. It should avoid being there when the punch lands. His logic was based on a simple tactical calculus. German tanks carried immense frontal armor, making them invulnerable from the front. To kill them, you had to hit the sides. To hit the sides, you had to flank them. And to flank a Panzer before its turret could traverse, you needed speed blistering, reckless speed. The army brass was skeptical. They believed that sending men into battle in lightly armored vehicles was suicide. They called his ideas insane. But the threat of the Panzers was so great that they built the vehicle anyway. The contract went to the Buick Motor Division in 1942, and the project was handed to the legendary design studio of Harley Earl. These were the same designers who would later craft the tail-finned icons of 1950s Americana. They approached the tank destroyer not as a piece of heavy machinery, but as a high-performance vehicle. The result, the M18, was unlike anything in the global arsenal. To achieve the required speed, they stripped the armor down to the bare minimum. The M18 weighed just 18 tons, compared to the Panther's 45 and the Tiger's 57. The frontal hull armor was a terrifyingly thin 13 millimeters. The turret face offered only 25 millimeters. When the crews first saw the specifications, the reaction was a mixture of disbelief and horror. 13 millimeters is not armor, it is barely a skin. It was thin enough that standard infantry rifles couldn't penetrate it, but a 50 caliber round could punch right through, and any anti-tank weapon would slice through it like paper. The crews grimly joked that the steel was only there to keep the wind and rain out. They knew that inside that hull, they weren't protected. They were merely hidden from view. But the trade-off was under the hood. The engine was a Wright R975 radial, an aircraft engine designed to pull planes through the sky, now crammed into a chassis half the weight of a Sherman. The result was a top speed of 55 miles per hour on roads, with an acceleration that could snap necks. It was the fastest tracked armored fighting vehicle of the war. They gave it a name that perfectly matched its volatile, dangerous personality, the Hellcat. The tactical advantage of the Hellcat was rooted in cold, hard mathematics. Consider the geometry of a tank battle. At 30 miles per hour, an M18 covered 44 feet every second. Recall the German Panther's flaw. It took 15 to 20 seconds to traverse its turret, 90 degrees. In those crucial 15 seconds, while the German gunner was desperately cranking his wheel or waiting for the hydraulics to catch up, a Hellcat could travel over 600 feet. That is 200 yards of lateral movement. This created an impossible cognitive load for German gunners. Aiming a tank gun requires leading the target, estimating where the enemy will be when the shell arrives. But the Hellcat moved so fast and changed direction so violently that the calculations were impossible to perform in real time. A German gunner had two choices: lead the target and pray it maintained its course, or try to track it and watch the shells explode harmlessly in the Hellcat's wake. Either way, the German was likely to miss his first shot, and against the Hellcat, you only got one shot. Because, while the German turret was still struggling to rotate, the Hellcat crew riding on a superior torsion bar suspension that allowed for a stable firing platform was already lining up a 76mm high-velocity round on the Panther's thin-side armor. The Hellcat didn't just have a fast turret. The entire vehicle could reposition faster than the enemy could react. This was the math of survival. Velocity beats armor, provided you have the nerve to keep moving. That math would face its ultimate test in December 1944. The Wehrmacht had launched a massive, desperate counteroffensive through the Ardennes, aiming to split the Allied armies. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion found itself attached to the 101st Airborne Division at the crucial crossroads of Bastogne. Their commander was Lieutenant Colonel Clifford Templeton, a man who understood Bruce's doctrine perfectly. When German armor from the 2nd Panzer Division threatened to overrun the village of Neuville, just north of Bastogne, the 705th was sent to plug the gap. They joined Team de Sabri, a patchwork force of Shermans, Hellcats, and paratroopers from the 506th, commanded by Major William de Sabri. De Sabri was only 26 years old, and he was staring down the barrel of an entire Panzer division. The battlefield conditions were nightmarish. The fog was so thick that visibility was often reduced to 20 yards. Engagements were happening at point-blank range, distances where the Hellcat's speed should have been negated and its thin armor should have guaranteed destruction. Inside the Hellcats, the tension was suffocating. The M18 had an open-top turret, no roof. This gave the commander excellent visibility, but it exposed the crew to the freezing rain, the deafening roar of battle, and the terror of sniper fire. In that fog, every shadow looked like a tiger, and every sound could be the crack of the 88mm gun that killed you. Adaptation was the only way to survive. The 705th developed a technique in the narrow streets of Neuville that would become legendary. A Hellcat would race to a street corner, engine roaring. The commander would spot the silhouette of a Panther through the gray mist. The gunner would fire one shot, aiming for the tracks or the flank, and then the driver would slam the vehicle into reverse at maximum speed. By the time the Panther's turret had begun its slow, groaning rotation to return fire, the Hellcat was already gone, vanishing behind a building or down an alleyway. Moments later, that same Hellcat, using its superior automotive speed, would circle the block and appear on the opposite side of the German column. Another shot, another kill, another disappearance. The psychological impact on the German crews was devastating. They couldn't track their enemy. Every time they turned their heavy armor to face a threat, another one appeared from a blind spot. The reports sent to the 2nd Panzer Division headquarters grew increasingly frantic and alarmed. They claimed they were being swarmed from all sides, estimating the opposing force to be a full American armored division. In reality, they were being dismantled by a single reinforced battalion, a 26-year-old major, and a handful of tank destroyers, playing a deadly game of hide-and-seek. However, speed was not a shield, and the cost of this strategy was horrific. With only 13 millimeters of steel between them and the enemy, any hit on a Hellcat was usually fatal. German 75mm rounds didn't just penetrate. They often passed through one side of the hull and out the other, turning the interior into a blender of shrapnel and spalling. Crews who got caught in the open died instantly. Those who misjudged their timing by a fraction of a second died. And those who were simply unlucky faced the unique nightmare of the open turret. The lack of a roof was the M18's most controversial feature. While it saved weight, it left the crew vulnerable to artillery airbursts and mortar rounds. A shell didn't need to hit the tank to kill the crew. It just needed to explode above it, raining jagged steel directly onto the heads of the men inside. It was a fast ride, but it was a cold, open grave if you stopped moving. Colonel Templeton drove his men relentlessly because he understood the binary nature of their existence. Static defense meant death. Movement meant survival. Over the critical days of December 19th and 20th, Team de Sabri and the 705th destroyed over 30 German tanks around Nouville. The village eventually fell. The American force was simply too small to hold back the tide of the entire 2nd Panzer Division indefinitely. But their ferocious, mobile defense had bought time-critical, priceless hours that allowed the 101st Airborne to establish the defensive perimeter that would ultimately save Bastogne. Templeton survived the Battle of the Bulge and continued to lead his men into Germany. Tragically, on March 1st, 1945, an artillery shell struck his command post. He was killed in action, never seeing the final victory that his tactical brilliance had helped secure. 4 months later, as the war in Europe entered its final act, a different Hellcat battalion would prove the validity of the speed doctrine in a completely different theater. The 805th Tank Destroyer Battalion was the only unit in Italy fully equipped with M18s. Their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Fowler, led a unit that had developed a unique, rebellious culture. The crews painted unauthorized logos on their turrets, a cartoon black cat biting a tank set against an orange disc. High Command ordered them to remove the markings, citing uniform regulations. The crews refused. It was a small act of defiance, but it was significant. They knew they were driving the most fragile vehicles in the theater. That snarling cat logo was their way of baring their teeth, a statement that if they were going to die in these tin cans, they would do it with their own identity. In April 1945, the Allies launched their final offensive in Italy. After months of grinding, static warfare in the brutal terrain of the Apennine Mountains, the Allied forces broke through into the Po Valley. Suddenly, the landscape changed. The Po Valley stretched out like a billiard table flat, open, with paved roads and no hedgerows to impede movement. It was perfect Hellcat country. The German forces were in full retreat, streaming north toward the Alps in long, disorganized columns of trucks, half-tracks, and armor. The soldiers called what happened next the rat race. The 805th crews found themselves in a situation that tank destroyer doctrine had only dreamed of. They were not fighting a static line, they were chasing a fleeing enemy. The Hellcats utilized their 55 miles per hour's top speed to devastating effect. They didn't drive behind the German columns, they drove parallel to them. On the open roads, the M18s would pull alongside the retreating Germans, matching their speed at 30 or 40 miles per hour, and open fire from the flank. It was a surreal, high-speed massacre. The 76mm guns raked the German columns, destroying trucks and half-tracks in passing. German tank gunners frantically cranked their turrets, trying to bring their guns to bear on the Americans racing beside them. But the geometry was hopeless. By the time a Panther's gun had traversed, the Hellcat that fired the shot was already 200 yards down the road, engaging the next target. It was a drive-by shooting on an industrial scale. Because the 805th was the only Hellcat battalion in the entire Italian theater, their mobility completely baffled German intelligence. A Black Cat spotted engaging units outside Bologna in the morning would be reported 50 miles north by the afternoon. The Germans believed they were facing multiple battalions, unable to comprehend that a single unit could cover so much ground so quickly. The pursuit moved so fast that the American crews couldn't even stop to guard the prisoners they captured. They would simply disarm the stunned Germans, point them toward the rear, and keep driving. The adrenaline was constant. Crews later recalled the wind whipping through the open turrets, the blur of the Italian countryside, and the feeling of being in a hunt rather than a battle. When the smoke cleared and the war ended, the statistics vindicated the design. The M18 Hellcats had compiled the highest kill-to-loss ratio of any American tank or tank destroyer in the war. They were credited with 526 confirmed kills. Their overall exchange ratio was roughly 4-to-1, meaning for every Hellcat lost, nearly 2.5 German vehicles were destroyed. This was better than the Sherman, rivaling the heavy-hitting M10 and superior to almost anything else the Americans fielded. However, historians have debated the source of this success. Critics, including Steven Zaloga, have pointed out that the M18 was a poorly balanced design, too specialized, and too vulnerable for general warfare. Zaloga argued that the Hellcat's impressive record was attributable to the elite nature of the crew's highly trained specialists, who likely would have succeeded in any vehicle rather than the machine itself. Perhaps there is truth to this, but it misses a fundamental point. Those men chose how times to fight, based on what their machine allowed them to do. They chose speed, flanking maneuvers, and hit-and-run tactics because the Hellcat made those tactics possible. A heavier, slower vehicle would have forced them into a slugging match, a match they likely would have lost against German heavy armor. Different tactics would have led to different outcomes, and very likely, more American graves. The M18 Hellcat was retired almost immediately after the war. The entire tank destroyer doctrine was deemed a failure and abandoned. The US Army decided that the future lay in the main battle tank, a single vehicle that combined firepower, armor, and mobility, rather than specialized units. The cruiser philosophy was dead, but the lesson of the Hellcat remained etched in military history. The engagements at Nouville and the Po Valley proved that on the battlefield, power is nothing without the ability to apply it. German tankers learned the hard way that they couldn't hit what they couldn't track. 15 seconds of turret traverse time is a mere inconvenience in a static drill, but it is an eternity against a vehicle moving 44 feet per second. The Panthers and Tigers were better tanks by every conventional measure. Thicker armor, bigger guns, more complex engineering. But conventional measures failed to account for the audacity of an 18-ton hot rod that could be somewhere else before you finished pulling the trigger. At Nouville, the 705th used speed to survive against impossible odds. In the Po Valley, the 805th used speed to annihilate a retreating army. Both campaigns proved the same timeless, bloody truth. Sometimes the fastest way to win is to never let your enemy get a clean